I want to begin today by talking about Holmes as an Enlightenment ideal again. We were discussing Sherlock Holmes last time, and today we're going to be primarily looking at the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche, someone who is in rebellion against these Enlightenment ideals. But let me begin by reminding you what they are. Holmes is a kind of archetype of the scientific method. He clearly believes there are truths that are absolute and independent of any individual mind. And as we saw last time, that's a very common thing in detective-type stories. You've got to believe that there's a mind-independent truth about who did it. Otherwise, it's hard to see the point of what's going on. And so the thought here is that there are certain truths that are true no matter what anybody happens to think about it or believe about it. The second thing, knowledge. It is possible to have knowledge of some of these. If you thought, well, somebody did it, but there's no way to know who, there wouldn't be much point to detective fiction either. And so the stories rely on the thought, not only that there is some objective knowledge, objective truth, but also objective knowledge. Now notice, Holmes has knowledge of various different kinds, right? We saw last time, he has an extensive knowledge of scientific law, even obscure scientific facts, but also he has a great understanding of what's around him, based on, as he puts it, observation rather than just seeing. He observes things, he watches very closely, and then he does engage in scientific method and actually test things. And that brings us to the third thesis, that the use of reason, and in particular the use of the scientific method, is the best way to achieve objective knowledge. There are objective truths, there are things that we can know, among them at any rate, and then, how do we know them? Well, we know them by the use of reason, rational methods, observation and scientific method. And then finally, this enables us to make progress. Progress on solving the crime, yes, but in general of achieving our aims, whatever they are. And Holmes's readers could look to the advances due to technology to say, yes, over the last century, the scientific method and its application to the problems of human life have made things better and better. Now, there are a number of other themes that I think lurk in these stories. One is equality. Anyone is capable of rational action. Now, some people are a lot better at it than others. Holmes in particular excels at it, Watson somewhat less so, and then Lestrade, the police detective, even less so. But nevertheless, anybody is capable of progress, capable of self-improvement by using rational methods more and emotion less. In addition to that, since some people are much better at it than others, some people are much more capable than others, some perform much better than others, some exercise their capacities much more than others. So everyone has the capacity for rational thought, but some people actually employ it much more than other people. And so there is a sense in which, look, it's not just that Holmes is a detective, he's an excellent detective. Lestrade is not just a detective, he's actually a rather bad detective in the stories. Now interestingly, the TV and movie representations tend to improve Lestrade a lot, because they don't want you to hate the police detective, they don't want to make fun of him. But in the actual stories, Lestrade is not a very admirable fellow at all. And so his capacities are really quite low. Now, last time we asked that question. What are the features that Holmes admires about Irene Adler and despises about the king? And here are some thoughts we might have about that. There is a distrust of authority that runs through these stories. The king represents a kind of authority. This is not the only reason, by the way. He represents a sort of very superficial view of what merit consists in. Irene Adler is brilliant, and the king is somewhat oafish, but thinks very highly of himself, thinks Irene Adler is not at his level, and so on. But here are some of the things that are said about Inspector Lestrade in the story. Lestrade, by the way, is French for the raised platform. In other words, it's kind of like the empty chair type of thing. He's described as a little sallow, rat-faced, dark-eyed fellow, the best of a bad lot, as utterly conventional. And so throughout Scotland Yard, Lestrade, other examples of authority are not treated very kindly at all. But here's what I really wanted to lay out most clearly. There is a sort of tragic vision underlying these stories. Holmes has to make choices, and a lot of the stories involve tragic choices that Holmes makes. He has to achieve this end or that end, and he can't have both. So in this story in particular, what is the tragic choice? About the photo?
They have to accept the fact that they can't get the picture.
Oh, well, okay, good. He doesn't succeed here, right? He cannot himself get the picture, so that's the first thing. He actually fails at his mission in this story. And so that's one element. He also drops it at that point, right? He doesn't continue and say, aha, I have to chase Adler and get it back. No, he doesn't. Why does he make the choice to lose, basically, in this case? Yeah?
He doesn't want to work for the king because he distrusts authority and the king represents authority.
Well, okay, he doesn't really want to achieve the king's aims, partly because he represents authority and he distrusts that, partly because he decides that the aims of the king aren't very admirable. In general, the king has behaved rather badly in all of this. It's Irene Adler who's behaved well. And so he has a sense of virtue here that is not tied to authority positions or titles or even being a monarch or anything like that. But there's something else, right? Holmes describes her as the woman. There's an emotion he feels here that he normally keeps far away from his work. What is the emotion? Love, yeah. He finds himself falling in love with her. And so what does he do? Well, he has to make a choice here. And in general, Holmes has to make that choice. He takes the personal, the emotional aspects of things, and as far as he can, he pushes them aside. He sacrifices a personal life in order to lead a better professional life, in order to be a better detective, to get at the truth better. And so he feels like, well, either I can lead a normal human life, or I can excel at what I'm doing. And I have to make a choice. I cannot do both. There is some point at really any professional level, I think, where people have to make those kinds of choices. I have a colleague who is absolutely brilliant and has achieved at a remarkably high level. He is an academic superstar, not only quite famous, but somebody whose achievements have been amazing throughout his career. But the personal cost to that has been absolutely amazing. He has spent most of his life sitting in dingy rooms writing extensive notes on white pads. He was married for a while, but that fell apart. He had kids, and they sort of hated him. He really had to give up almost entirely on a personal life in order to achieve that level of academic and intellectual success. Now, he is a superstar. If we gave Nobel Prizes in philosophy, he'd be a Nobel Prize winner. On the other hand, he's had to sacrifice immensely to do it. And part of what happens in these stories is something very much like that. You can lead a normal life like Watson, and you can be virtuous, and you can even be good. But are you going to be brilliant like Holmes? Are you going to excel at the highest levels? No. Holmes has to sacrifice almost everything else. His own emotional life, his own personal life, love for Irene Adler, and so on, in order to achieve what he does. And so there's a tension here. Yes, reason is the way to achieve these aims most effectively. On the other hand, look at the cost of using it. So that sense of the cost to Holmes and the people around him is something that runs all through the stories. Now, this, by the way, is why I hate certain movie representations of Holmes. Because they utterly subjugate the reason part, utterly subjugate the tragic vision, and Holmes just becomes this swashbuckling guy. You probably know what I'm referring to. If you've seen any of those movies, they're terrible. Forget them. Never watch them again. Okay, now, there is then something about the Enlightenment ideal that both represents a sense of immense hope that we can actually know objective truths through the use of reason, but also the kind of worry that Doyle is expressing here, that there is a real cost to that, a real human cost. Friedrich Nietzsche is somebody who takes, as it were, the other side of this. On the one hand, Nietzsche is an advocate of two-level theories. He believes there is a surface level to be explained, and there is a depth level underlying that does the explaining. He inherits that part from the Enlightenment. But he then turns that against the surface level, in a sense. Now, I don't want you to get the impression that two-level theories are bad, or that I don't like them, or something like that. The atomic theory of matter is a two-level theory. There's nothing wrong with that. Physics, chemistry, biology, in their modern forms, all depend on this two-level approach to things. So does modern linguistics, so does modern psychology. So there's nothing wrong with such a theory in itself. But when you apply them to human beings, they do generate certain puzzles, certain things you have to figure out in order to understand what it is to be human. How do we make sense of ourselves as agents? People who decide, think, intend, and act. Well, it's not an easy question. We've talked about it in terms of this stereoscopic vision. We, on the one hand, see the world as it ordinarily appears to us, a world of tables and chairs and people and computers and cats. And then we think about a world of electrons and various kinds of gravitational fields and other fields, weak forces, strong forces in the atom, and so on. And that's a picture that looks very different, and yet it's also a description of the world. And they're both accurate in some sense. The question is, how do you put them together? Now, when I think about tables, it's not that hard to put them together, I think, though there is a 20th century literature about tables and how you put them together specifically with respect to that. But when we apply it to human beings, we get a much harder problem, as we've seen. The manifest image, this ordinary picture we have of the world, is a macro level of description, and it suggests a picture of us human beings as beings that do think, decide, intend, and act, and can do so well or bad. But on the scientific image, this micro-level description, it looks like they're just particles and fields that are behaving according to certain natural laws. We don't find any intentions there, any decisions, any freedom to act or not to act. And so, how do we put those things together? I might say at the manifest image level, when we turn to ourselves, we think of ourselves as rational agents, as making decisions, as doing so for good or for evil, and so being subject to moral rules. We think of ourselves as taking responsibility for things, having responsibility for things. We think of ourselves as acting freely, as really making choices, as free agents exercising free will. And we think of ourselves as using practical reason, solving practical problems by means of rational thought. But the scientific image is very different. There, things are governed by these causal laws, or maybe in quantum mechanics, statistical laws, but in any case, nothing that really looks anything like a free decision. And so that seems to be utterly value-free. Wow, look at what happened here. The electron went through the right slit. Do we say, ooh, should it have? Bad electron. You should have gone through the left slit. So we go. We don't do that, right? We don't think electrons make decisions and behave for good or for bad that way. We don't sort of look at the atomic bomb as it explodes in a nuclear test and say, bad bomb, why did you do that? It's not something that takes place there. There we think of things as either purely determined, or if we stress certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, then a combination of determinism and then just utter randomness. We don't think in terms of free decisions based on rational kinds of considerations. So there's a natural clash between these two images. Do we have freedom or not? Are we beings entirely governed by physical laws or not? And it's hard to say. It is hard to say then what becomes of values. What about rules of morality? Even just rules of practical advice. Are they really rules that have any significance? Or is it a matter of us just telling some weird kind of story about something entirely different? Now, that gives us this sort of problem. Reflected in this dramatic Berlin sculpture in the middle of a river. Are we people who are really human beings making decisions, or are we just governed by scientific laws? Okay, well, on and on about that. Let's get to Nietzsche, because he has a unique way of addressing these problems. As you can see, he lived in the latter half of the 19th century. He was a German philosopher who actually spent most of his life teaching and then writing in Switzerland. He suffered from ill health throughout much of his life and ended up spending the last few years of his life in an asylum. His writings go through a number of different stages. His early writings tend to be essays of a pretty traditional form. And then he goes through this middle period of books that contain some very brief aphorisms and then some longer sections that are more sustained. And then by the end of his life, he's writing very short aphorisms and screeds, and there's very little argument of any kind at all. Well, what we're looking at here is primarily from his early period and his, I guess you could say, early middle period. A time during which he seems to embrace relativism. Now, later, I think he moves and doesn't quite do that. But at this stage of Human All Too Human and The Cheerful Science, I'll come back to that title in a moment, he is, I think, an outright relativist. What is a relativist? Well, someone who holds that there are no universally valid truths about the world. Protagoras was the most famous ancient Greek relativist who held this, that man is the measure of all things. And here he doesn't really mean humanity. He means each individual person is the measure of all things. For example, is it warm in this classroom or not? How many of you think it's warm? How many of you think it's comfortable? How many of you think it's cool? Okay. Now, what's the truth of the matter? Well, most of you find it comfortable. So we could say, it's comfortable. Or I could think, well, I've been outside recently and was scrambling for my last class, so to me it's warm, and so on. But we can just say with Protagoras, look, there's no such thing as whether this room is warm or comfortable or cool. It just depends on you. It can be warm for one person and comfortable for another and cool for another person. And that's okay. People have different preferences about this. We feel this way about tastes in all sorts of things. Are mushrooms good food or bad food? I love mushrooms, so I would say mushrooms are good. But my wife hates mushrooms. She would say mushrooms are bad. Okay? Calamari, good or bad?
Good.
Good. Okay. Once, I was at a job interview, and the person there interviewing me took me to dinner and said, "So, for an appetizer, shall we have some calamari?" I said, "I'd rather eat rubber bands." So I didn't get the job. But you might say, look, there's no truth of the matter about this. You know, it can be possible for one person to like mushrooms, another not. One person likes calamari, another doesn't. That's fine. Matters of taste are like that. But lots of things we think are universal. They're not just matters of taste, or well, true for you, not true for me, or something, but instead they're universally true. What are some things that seem to be universally true, where I am not the measure is something outside of me? Yeah? Gravity. The law of gravity seems to be a good example. Okay, gravitational force is the gravitational constant times the product of the masses divided by the square of the distance between the objects. At least that's true for me. It was true for Newton. Is it true for you? I don't know. Let's find out. That's not really, the way we think about these things. We think about the law of gravitation as a universal truth. Can you think of other examples? Yeah.
Boiling temperature for water?
Good, the boiling temperature for water, 212 Fahrenheit, 100 degrees centigrade. You might think, look, that's just what it is, right? Now, that can vary with altitude. Somebody in Denver could say, it's not true for me. But there's a rule about that, too. It's not something that we can say, it's just like, that guy in Denver is really high, if you know what I mean. So, it's a lot, water boils at a different temperature in his house. No, we think that this happens in a regular way that doesn't depend on people's states of mind. So relativism in the form that Nietzsche is advancing it, or in Protagoras' form, is quite a radical thesis. It's a claim that not just truths about mushrooms and calamari, but all truths are really relative to a society, or a culture, or some sort of historical epoch, or an interpretive community, or even an individual person. Now, you could be a relativist about everything, as Protagoras seemed to be. Or you could just be a relativist about certain things. Most of us are relativists about tastes in food, for example. Or about comedy. That's another classic example. Is Stephen Wright funny or not? Most of you wouldn't know who Stephen Wright is. He's a very deadpan comic. Here's one of his jokes, it's very philosophical, so it's one of my favorites. Last night, somebody came into my place, stole everything, replaced it with exact duplicates. I think that's really funny, but but a lot of people didn't laugh, right? Most of you didn't laugh. You sort of thought, that's not funny. And, first of all, never mind. We tend to think, you have no taste, you have no sense of humor or something, or you're just not philosophically minded enough or whatever. But the fact is, certain jokes like that can be funny for one person and not very funny for another person. And that's fine. Here's a joke that has sent me into laughing fits for hours. Dad and son are sitting there at the breakfast table getting ready for school, eating breakfast. Father decides to have a serious conversation with his son and so says, "Son, what do you want to be when you grow up?" Little kid says, "I want to be a vitamin." And father says, "What do you mean, a vitamin?" Kid says, "It says right here in the cereal box, vitamin B1. Well, I've been known to stand for hours until like 3 in the morning laughing at that joke. Now, ordinarily, you might say, all right, it's a little funny. It's not that funny. But those are things we think do vary with individual people. Are there other things that vary with Societies or cultures. Sure, like what?
Like how people dress.
Good, like how people dress. People dress differently in different cultures. And so something that is entirely appropriate dress in one place might be very inappropriate dress in another culture, even in the same type of setting, right? I was mentioning actually to just my last class, the way I'm dressed here seems to be an appropriate way to dress, in Texas anyway, but when I visited Scandinavia, I really stick out. It's a bizarre way to dress. Everybody in Scandinavia seems to wear very dark colors. For a man, at any rate, to wear light-colored tan pants, it's just bizarre. Nobody else looks like that. And so I'm thought to be ridiculously garish in Denmark if I go and dress the way I normally dress. There are different standards even within that. And then, of course, much more remote cultures, it would be very different. In some cultures, to teach you, I would have to be, dressed in a loincloth and beating on a drum or something. I'm glad I don't live in such a culture. If you are too, I'm sure. Where other things that might vary culture to culture. Yeah.
Definitely cultural norms like behavior, and then like religion and.
Ooh, religion, yes, and all sorts of other forms of behavior. What counts as rude behavior and what counts as acceptable manners varies from place to place. And so in some places you have to go through certain rituals. It's considered bad manners to do certain things or not do certain things. In other contexts, it's just the reverse. And so those are things. What counts as good etiquette, that changes from culture to culture. The language people use, of course, changes from culture to culture, but also even the kinds of language, how formal the language is something that just changes from society to society. Changes in one society over time. And so all of those things are things that shift. The question, and so it's natural to be a relativist about some things, but what about the most fundamental things? Nietzsche says that really in the end, truth, period, is relative to historical era. That is to say, what's true in general about anything varies historically. It's not just the truths about comedy, or taste in food, or taste in clothing, or manners, or the way we describe things, how formally, informally, in what language, and so on. Yeah, that varies, but everything else does too. He sees this as a general thing. Now, he's getting this in part from an earlier German philosopher, Hegel. Hegel lived at the beginning of the 19th century, and writes, unfortunately, in very difficult prose. Otherwise, I would have you read little. But I don't believe in torture, so I won't make you do it. Anyway, he advocates this kind of historical relativism in general. However, he says there are certain basic principles that govern the way thought changes, the way thought develops. And so, although there are no principles about the world or about human beings that are really universal, there are principles about how thought develops, about how we change our ideas that are universal. And so there are some general, dynamic, sort of meta-level laws about the development of thought. So we can describe it this way. Our theories about the world change. Those things are relative. Our conceptions of the world itself, as well as manners and comedy and food and all of that, changes over time. But, Hegel says, our understanding of what it is to think rationally doesn't change. And so the way in which we change our thinking is something that is law-governed and doesn't change over time. Our ideas change, but the laws governing the change of ideas, those are universal. And he thinks he has a rule for that, in fact, that is sometimes described in this very simple way. There's a thesis that is meant to capture the truth about some aspect of the world. There are certain inadequacies in it, and so it's replaced by an antithesis that starts from an opposite starting point and tries to characterize the same thing. And that too has its inadequacies, and so eventually people put these together and say, let's see if we can capture something that is the strengths of both, and they come up with a synthesis of these two ideas, and then the process starts all over again. Well, that's sort of a little note card version. Other people who were influenced by Hegel developed that into a different theory. In C.S. Peirce, an American philosopher who founded pragmatism, the idea is, no, it's scientific method that is the method, not this thesis-antithesis thing, but instead hypothesis, and then experimental results, then reformulation of hypothesis, etc. That's the process. And the idea is that science is self-correcting. We make observations, we formulate hypotheses, we test them by experiment, and then we revise our hypotheses. This is exactly Holmes's method. And so we find that although our theories of the world change, they change because we apply the scientific method. They change in rational ways. Nietzsche denies all of that. He basically says, yeah, our ideas of the world change. But in the end, not for rational reasons governed by the laws of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or by scientific method, instead in utterly irrational ways, driven by other factors. He says, what if thought doesn't change in rational, law-governed ways? For example, clothing was mentioned, fashion. Does fashion change in rational, rule-governed ways according to the scientific method? No, right? I mean, consider a change in fashion. What is a good example? Well, now, actually, men often don't wear ties, right? It's pretty, you gotta be a very formal occasion, really, for most men to wear a tie nowadays. 20 years ago, that wasn't true. Men wore ties a lot. 20 years before that, when I was in school, for example, my professors generally wore ties and suits. Not just sport jackets and so on, but actual wool suits. And for a professor not to have a suit and a tie was thought to be really weird. You must be some kind of hippie. Okay? And now if I came in a suit and tie, most of you would think, that's strange, why are you dressed up so formally? Well, that sort of thing has changed over time. Did it change in response to rational, rule-governed considerations? Did it change in response to the scientific method? Did we do experiments and find out students learn better when professors dress sloppily? No. Okay? Or a classic case, women's skirt lengths. Sometimes they're higher, sometimes they're lower. Is it driven by rational considerations? I don't know what it's driven by. Some people think laws of economics. And I must admit, there is a correlation. I sometimes look at the fashion catalogs my wife or my daughters get, and I look at the skirt lengths, and I think, ooh, I should sell stocks, or I should buy stocks on the basis of this. But on the other hand, it's like hard to tell that I mean, it's not like I think fashion designers think, yes, the Fed's thinking about raising interest rates, so I think we better lower headlines. So I'm not sure exactly how all this works, but it seems to be an irrational process. And so Nietzsche says, look, that's true in general. We not only have these changes in our theories of the world or of human beings, the way in which we even think about these changes changes. Okay? In other words, there isn't some universal thing like scientific method, or the process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or some other explanation that explains all of that. In the end, it's largely driven by contingent and irrational factors. Our ideas of the world and our ideas about theories, our ideas about ideas, all of these things change in ways that aren't particularly rational. Now, he's not denying that there can be some rationality to it, but he's saying it is not primarily rational. So, nearly all philosophical problems once again raise the same form of question as they did 2,000 years ago. How can something develop from its opposite? For example, reason from the unreasonable, feeling from the dead, logic from the illogical, disinterested gaze from covetous wanting, altruism from egoism, truth from error. He is in part here thinking about two-level theories. He's thinking, how can something like truth, like beauty, like logic, like rationality, how can that arise from purely chemical materials? He said everything we need and which can be given to us, only now that the individual sciences have reached their present height, is a chemistry of the moral, religious, and aesthetic conceptions and sensations. So he's saying if you want to understand, for example, morality, don't think about the right, the good, and other things like that. Investigate the chemistry of how people form these ideas. Same thing with religion. What's the true religion, if any? Don't think in terms of God and in terms of theology. Think about chemistry. Think about biochemistry and what would make people think some of these things. And the same true with our conceptions of beauty, with our conceptions of sensations, what is pleasant and unpleasant, what's desirable and undesirable. All of that, in the end, he says, comes down to physiology. So in his view, truth doesn't develop rationally in response to arguments or scientific method. Instead, it's irrational. In fact, in the end of his life, he suggests it's really driven by one factor, the will to power. But at the early stage in Human All Too Human and the gay science, he isn't thinking in those terms exactly yet. It's just driven by irrational forces, by desires, by wants, by all sorts of things that motivate us, that have nothing in particular to do with reason. And so he says, what if this chemistry would reveal that in these areas too, that is to say in morality, in religion, in politics, in our theories of the arts, in our understanding of the highest things of human existence, what if the most glorious colors arise from low, despised materials? In the end, just from the motions of the electrons, just from the atomic field, just from the things happening inside the atom and the way in which atoms interact. Now, this thought sits somewhat uncomfortably with his relativism. Because here's one way of taking this, and the Enlightenment way of saying, in the end, we're driven by our own biochemistry, and so, in the end, all of this must reduce down to those kinds of considerations. But that seems to treat science as if it really captures an absolute truth. In the end, he doesn't think that. He says, philosophers automatically think of man as an aeterna veritas, an eternal truth, as a constant in the flux, as a safe measure of things to come. Everything the philosophers say about man is no longer fundamental. It tells us something about the men of a very limited period of time. Lack of historical sense is the hereditary error of all philosophers. So he's saying basically that philosophy too doesn't reveal any universal truths about the world or about humanity. In the end, it can only tell us about the way in which people at a given time see things. You can study ancient Greek thought, and that tells you something about the way people thought about the world, the way they thought about themselves in ancient Greece. Then you move to the medieval world. People are thinking about God, about human beings again in the world. That tells you something about them, but it doesn't tell you anything absolute about any of those topics they're thinking about. So Nietzsche says. And so here he puts it most baldly. Everything became what it is. He's stressing again the historical development. There are no eternal facts. There are no absolute truths. Therefore, what is needed from now on is historical philosophizing, and with it the virtue of modesty. Saying, in other words, here's how it appears to me, but not making any claim that this is the way in any absolute sense things are. Well, Nietzsche is really the first of a series of relativists. In fact, one way of looking at the 20th century is to describe it as a century in which relativism, which had largely been buried since ancient Greece and Western civilization, comes back and becomes a very significant intellectual force. Now, there is a sense in which, as we've seen, lots of us are relativists about lots of things. But there are many things about which we don't tend to be relativists. And so Nietzsche's claim is meant to be shocking, because he means it to apply to everything. He says, I'm not just talking about tastes. I'm not just talking about art. I'm not just talking about moral standards or standards of etiquette or anything like that. He says what we now call the world is the result of a number of errors and fantasies which have gradually developed throughout the whole evolution of organic nature, have intertwined with one another, and are now left to us as the cumulative treasure of the entire past. As treasure because the value of our humanity rests on. What makes us valuable as human beings? What differentiates us from the animals? Well, it's partly having ideas, having moral notions, thinking of ourselves as having free will, as being rational. And yet, he says, all of that's really in the end an error. It's a fantasy. We have this fantasy that we're free, but we're not. We have this fantasy that we're making decisions, but we're not. We have this fantasy that we are something higher than the animals, and that we're driven by something other than merely physical law, but we're not. All of that is really an error, a fantasy. So what we call civilization is really just a series of things built upon these errors and fantasies. Now, he says, everything that's made metaphysical assumptions valuable, frightful, delightful is passionate, error, self-deception. The worst methods of attaining knowledge are taught us to believe in. So in the end, he says, any way you happen to see the world, in the end, just rest on this sort of stuff. Yeah?
Can you explain like metaphysical a little bit better? Because I kind of just
He's using lots of terms here and doing so very quickly. And so metaphysics is one of the basic areas of philosophy. In particular, metaphysics is concerned with the question of what there is, what the world consists of, what are the basic categories of things. So Aristotle, for example, in his metaphysics says, in the end, there are 10 categories of things. I won't go through them all, but the key thing is they all depend on the category of substance. So a way of putting Aristotle in ordinary language is just, what does the world consist of? Things, having properties, and standing in relations at certain times and places, and having then things happen to them. That's what the world consists of. Other people have said, no, the world consists mostly of events. or consists actually of minds, and everything else is a construction of a mind. But those are the basic questions of metaphysics. What is the world in the end really like? And he's saying here, any conception you have about the world like that, as consisting of objects, having properties and standing in relations, or consisting of minds interacting, or consisting of events happening, whatever that is, all of that's just passion, self-deception. Metaphysicians sit in seminars and they give arguments. You know, we sit around and we discuss a certain conception. We say, well, yeah, the table, is it just the same as the parts of the table, or is it the parts plus something else? And we teach whole courses on topics like that. And basically, Nietzsche scratches his head and not only says, what you're probably thinking, what a waste of time, but is also thinking, yeah, wait, all of that is based on something that in the end has nothing to do with this. What is it that makes one person attracted to this metaphysical picture and that to the other? Why does this person say the world consists of objects? This one says it consists of events. This one says it consists of microparticles. This one says it consists of minds. In the end, he says what matters there is not rational argument. It's just what somebody's psychology makes them find most attractive. So is there a God or is there not a God? Theologians debate the question, and Nietzsche just says, in the end, it's a psychological question. Really, what motivates you or anybody to think there's a God? What motivates some people to think there isn't? And so he's urging to say, look, in the end, there's no rational thing to be figured out here. It all rests on irrational stuff. So, knowledge, he says it doesn't progress according to laws. In fact, it doesn't necessarily progress at all. So he urges a different conception of science. The title of the book is Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, which is hard to translate. It's often translated as either the gay science, which is somewhat unfortunate now given the connotations of gay. That's not really what he had in mind. Or the joyful wisdom. But Wissenschaft is just the German for science. And Fröhliche is really more than just joyful. In fact, it's a cognate of the English word frolicking. And so playful, I translated it as cheerful in the readings, but actually playful is probably a better translation. The playful science. And indeed, in later works, he talks about stages of human development. And it's a stage where people view their life as play and retain their child's heart that in the end seems to him to be the highest form. So I think he's urging that human activity in general become more playful, that science become more playful, that philosophy become more playful, that we in effect try out ideas. Don't think of us as subjecting them to rational tests in quite the same way. Think of us as proposing things, suggesting things, and seeing how they fit. Now, he thinks that the world is really a projection, a largely irrational projection. We've looked at the world for thousands of years, with moral and aesthetic and religious demands. He says it's become wondrously multicolored, terrible, meaningful. But we've been the colorists. The world is actually in black and white. We're supplying all those colors. The reality is that we've projected our errors as appearances and its basic assumptions into things. We're the ones who have made the world look as if it's rich in color, rich in meaning, rich with all sorts of values. In fact, it's an utterly black and white world as described in the end by science, and a science itself that's got no claim on truth absolutely, but is instead driven by the same errors. Well, so far we've been neglecting Nietzsche's most famous thesis, that God is dead. He announces it at a certain place. In that work, he says after Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave. A tremendous shiver-inducing shadow. God is dead. But given humans as they are, there may be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow is shown. And we still have to defeat his shadow. Now, what on earth does Nietzsche mean in saying that God is dead? He announces it more formally in this passage. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning, ran into the market and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God! I'm looking for God! And there's a painting of the madman rushing into the square. He's referring here to the ancient Greek story of Diogenes running into the square looking for an honest man. But anyway, here's the way this story goes. As there were many who stood together there who didn't believe in God, he excited much laughter. Is he lost? Said one. Did he wander off like a child? Does he keep himself hidden? Is he afraid of us? Did he go to sea? Emigrate? In such a way they laughed and yelled in disorder. Nietzsche is the son of a preacher. And so he knows his Bible, even though he hates it. And here he is echoing Elijah, taunting the priest of Baal. At noon, Elijah began to taunt, shout louder. Surely he's a god. Maybe he's deep in thought, or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. It's the same sort of thing here. And the reference here is to the test of Baal versus Jehovah on Mount Carmel, where famously they take two piles of wood, basically, and say, all right, if your God is the true God, pray and let your God ignite in flames. Well, anyway, I won't go on with the rest of the story. It gets bloody, but that's what's in the back of Nietzsche's mind. He says, anyway, the madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his gaze. Where is God? He cried. I will tell you, we killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. Now, traditionally, the idea of human beings murdering God is ridiculous, right? God is the being that is all-powerful. And so surely couldn't be murdered by human beings. For that matter, God is eternal and couldn't die. So what on earth is he talking about when he says God is dead? What does Nietzsche have in mind? Yeah?
Is it possible that he's referring to our changing perception?
Yes, exactly. I think he's referring to our changing ideas. He's saying our ideas of absolutes are dying. And that, he thinks, essentially involves God. Because if there's any absolute in a traditional picture of the world, it's God. God, the unchanging, the eternal. And he's saying, yeah, if there's any absolute, it's God. But there are no more absolutes. And so actually, God is dead in this, he's saying, announcing, as it were, basically saying, well, our ability to believe in absolutes is dying. And he's partly making a sociological observation, saying religion is becoming a less significant force in Western culture. But partly, I think he is saying that there is something about the modern world that has made us unable to believe in God in the same way, at any rate, any longer. Now, he continues, God is dead. God remains dead, and we killed him. How can we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Isn't the size of the deed too large for us? Don't we have to become gods just to appear worthy of it? Well, this is a famous challenge. It took about 60 years for it to become well known. But here is a 1966 cover of Time magazine. Is God dead? Here's another take on it. God is dead. Nietzsche. Nietzsche is dead. God. Anyway. Here is, I think, the underlying thought in Nietzsche. There are no more absolutes. And so he sees us as being relativists. And he's really saying, yes, I'm a relativist. But he's also, I think, saying, actually, you're all becoming relativists. And that creates a problem. On the horizon of the infinite, we've left the land and gone to sea. We've burned the bridge behind us. Even more, we've destroyed the land behind us. Look ahead. Before us lies the ocean. To be sure, it doesn't always roar. Every now and then it lies there like silk and gold in a fantasy of grace. But hours will come when you recognize that it's infinite. There is nothing more terrible than infinity. There is no longer any land. So we no longer have any standards at all. And he concludes with some aphorisms. Thoughts. Thoughts are the shadows of our feelings, always darker, empty, or simpler. Remember that contrast we've seen. Hume saying, reason is enough to be the slave of the passions. Doyle saying, the passions are enough to be the slave of reason. And Nietzsche saying, actually, thoughts are always just cover, just rationalizations for our passions. What do you believe? That the weights of all things must be determined afresh, because all values have to be rethought now that we've given up a belief in absolutes. And finally, what does your conscience say? You are to become the person you are. In the end, that's the only guide he really gives us to values. How do we think all of this? It's a value of authenticity. Be the person you are. Next time, we'll look at a very different perspective that says, yes, a certain line of thinking ends up there, and that's a very bad place.